Una had prepared 17 strategies for surviving a brutal husband during the 3-week journey north. Strategy 1. Silence and compliance. Strategy 2. Be useful. Strategy 3 through 17 were variations on enduring quietly. She had not prepared for what to do if he was shy. But she was getting ahead of herself. 3 weeks ahead, in fact. And at this particular moment, she was still standing on the balcony of her father's keep in Viridia, the warm air sweet against her skin, for what she understood to be the last time as a daughter of this land. Below her, the final preparations were being made. Her guard, her dowry of grain wagons, the grim-faced emissaries from Stonefall who watched her with flat, unreadable eyes and looked exactly like their reputation, hard, weathered, and deeply unimpressed by her existence. Something in her, the part that was already cataloging the exits in any room she entered, the part that had assessed the Stonefall guards and concluded they were competent but tired, filed them under not hostile, just hungry. She didn't argue with that assessment. It was usually right, the animal instinct cutting through to the simple truth before her brain had finished composing a diplomatic sentence. Her father stepped onto the balcony. He looked at the grain wagons, calculating. The first shipment is generous, the second upon confirmation of the union. And what of me? His eyes showed what they always did, cool assessment of a strategic asset. You will do your duty, Una. You will secure this alliance. Your personal comforts are secondary to pack survival. Not your pack, not anymore. And Kalen? A promise made in peace. This is necessity. He understands. But he didn't. Kalen had whispered, I will not let that northern savage keep what is mine. Not, I love you, but I will not let him keep what is mine. She was a stolen jewel. Maeve, her handmaiden, appeared at the door, pale as fresh cream. My lady, it is time. Una took one last look at the verdant hills. She had learned to shift out there, her small gray wolf tumbling through wildflowers, all 4 paws going in different directions at once. She had been 12. She had sneezed mid-shift and ended up half wolf, half girl, stuck in a bramble bush, and had to be extracted by 2 very patient healers who never once laughed in front of her. One of them, she'd later learned, had told the story exactly once during a staff dinner, and still faced casual social death for it. Now she was being sent to a land of stone, to be wife to a man they called the Stonefall King, a man she had never met, a man whose people's history with hers was written in border skirmishes and bitter blood. She pulled her hood up and turned her back on the sun. Good, something in her decided. Soft places make soft people. Let's see what this stone is made of. She hadn't asked for that opinion. She ignored it and walked toward the carriage. The journey north was slow. Vibrant greens bled into muted grays. The air grew thinner. The Stonefall guards were silent, their faces carved from rock. Not unkind, one had offered Maeve his cloak without asking, but watchful, the way people watched things that might bite. Maeve shivered beside her in the carriage. It's so empty, my lady. Empty is underrated, Maeve, Una said, not looking away from the window. Empty doesn't have opinions about your breeding potential. Maeve went quiet then, in the way that suggested she was understanding something darker about her lady than she'd previously grasped. Una allowed herself the smallest smile. The keep of Stonefall rose from the mountain as though it had grown there. No gilding, no banners, just stone, efficient and unadorned. Good bones, her instincts noted. Wind-sheltered, defensible. She was not evaluating real estate. She was being delivered into exile. The carriage rolled into the main courtyard, and the silence hit her like a wall. The space was filled with wolves, both shifted and on 2 feet, lining the walls and balconies. No cheering, no welcome, just a sea of watchful eyes, their expressions ranging from grim curiosity to open resentment. They were looking at the Viridian princess who had been bought with their food. She didn't blame them. A lone figure descended the main steps. He was tall. He was also wide. He was, in fact, the broadest man she had ever seen, wrapped in dark furs that did nothing to conceal the sheer volume of him. His hair was dark brown, threaded with silver at the temples, pulled back from a face that was all harsh angles and jaw. The Stonefall King. Kian. He stopped before her carriage, and one of his guards moved to open the door. Kian held up a hand, stopping him. He opened it himself. It was a small thing, a nothing gesture, but it was the first unexpected kindness she had received in weeks, and it landed like a stone in still water. She gathered her skirts and descended, forcing herself to meet his gaze. His eyes were the biggest surprise. She had expected cold steel gray. Instead, they were a deep, clear blue, the color of a mountain lake in the rare moment the sun found it. And in their depths, she saw none of the arrogance or cruelty she had braced herself for. She saw weariness. She saw apprehension. She saw a man the size of a doorway who looked like he wanted to apologize for his own proportions. He was nervous. The enormous, terrifying Alpha King of Stonefall, who looked like he could snap a pine tree with his bare hands, was nervous to meet her. Strategy 1 through 17 had not accounted for this. "Lady Una," he said, his voice a low rumble like stones settling deep underground. "Welcome to Stonefall." "King Kian," she managed. The formal incline of her head felt absurd, like curtsying to a mountain. The ceremony was as stark as the keep. The great hall was a cavernous space, dominated by a hearth large enough to roast an ox. The air thick with pine, wood smoke, and the simmering tension of two packs who did not trust each other. Una stood beside Kian, her hand clammy in the crook of his arm. His arm was the approximate circumference of a young oak. She felt the weight of every stare. She was the outsider, the price, the woman they were going to watch like hawks to see if she tried to sabotage them from within. They spoke the old words, the vows of union that bound not just two people, but two packs. Her voice was barely a whisper. His was a steady baritone that resonated in the stone around them, as though the keep itself was listening. When he said the words about protection and honor, his hand tightened on hers. A promise, or possibly a warning. When it was done, a healer brought forth a single silver cup. They both drank. The wine tasted like ash. A feast followed, though there was no joy in it. The Stonefall wolves ate with a focused hunger that told her everything about the lean months they'd endured. Kian sat beside her, a silent, imposing presence. He made sure her plate and cup were always full, but he did not press her to eat or speak. He simply existed beside her, solid, warm, emanating a nervous energy that was almost comical, given that he was the size of a load-bearing wall. She caught herself studying the way he ate. Deliberate, unhurried. A man rationing even at his own wedding feast, making sure everyone else had enough before he took a second helping. She had seen men perform generosity before. Her father hosted feasts while his servants went hungry and called it leadership. This was different. This was a man eating last because he genuinely couldn't eat first. It was either the most admirable thing she'd ever seen or the most effective long-term manipulation strategy, and she hated that she couldn't tell the difference anymore. Feeds others first, something in her observed, isn't use his size as an excuse. This is problematic. She stabbed a piece of roasted root vegetable with unnecessary force. Finally, the long, dreadful evening ended. It was time. The moment she had been dreading above all others. Sorsha, the stout, gray-haired beta with the unmistakable authority of a woman who had been running this keep since before Kian was born and would likely continue running it after his death, approached them. "My king, the queen's chambers are prepared." Kian nodded. His expression was unreadable, which probably meant he was having the same thoughts everyone else was having about what a bride and groom did after a wedding feast. She could see it in the slight tension around his eyes. He rose and offered Una his hand. Her fingers trembled as she placed them in his. His hand was large, calloused, and so warm it was almost startling. His grip was gentle, careful in a way that a man that size had to be deliberate about. As they walked, she could feel his anxiety radiating off him like heat. The king of Stonefall, nervous about his own wedding night. It was almost endearing. He led her through winding stone corridors in silence. Her heart hammered. She had been trained for this. She knew what was expected. She would not show weakness. She would not panic. He led her to a heavy oak door at the end of a quiet corridor, away from the main clamor of the keep. He pushed it open. The room within was spacious. A large bed piled with furs. A hearth where a fire already crackled. A balcony overlooking dark, silent forest. It was a beautiful room. It was also, she noted, a room with excellent visibility and 2 exits. He'd put thought into her safety even here, in her wedding night chambers. He did not step inside. He stood at the threshold, his broad shoulders filling the frame with the kind of casual immensity that would have been frightening if he didn't look absolutely terrified. "These are your chambers, my lady." She waited. He reached into a pouch at his belt and drew out a heavy, ornate iron key. He held it out to her. His hand shook slightly. She stared at it. "The door has a strong lock," he said, those lake blue eyes fixed on hers. "This is the only key. It is yours." He pressed it into her hand. The metal was cold against her palm. "I have taken your home, Lady Una. I will not take your sanctuary too. I will not enter this room unless you invite me. That is my vow to you." She looked from the key to his face. The nervousness she'd seen in the courtyard was gone. In its place was something harder to look at, a sincerity so unguarded it felt almost reckless. This was a man who understood the mathematics of power and was deliberately handing it to a stranger. He gave a short bow. "Sleep well." He walked away, footsteps fading to nothing. Una closed the door, heard the satisfying click of the latch. She had prepared for a monster. She had no idea what to do with a man who locked himself out. She put the key on the mantel and went to bed. She didn't quite know why.
He made it to the end of the corridor before his legs informed him they were done cooperating. He leaned against the wall, the cold stone a mercy against his back, and pressed both palms over his face. "Well?" his wolf demanded. It had been filing objections since he'd handed over the key, a running litany of grievance delivered in the clipped tone of a general watching his commanding officer surrender the fortress. "You gave her the only key, to her room, in your keep, where you live. Explain the tactical advantage." "It was the right thing to do," he muttered into his hands. "She is ours. That is our territory. You have now locked yourself out of it. How do you plan to remedy this?" "By respecting that she's a woman who was sold to a stranger and dragged across a mountain range."
She deserves a door she can close. His wolf considered this with the visible reluctance of someone being asked to acknowledge a valid point they despised. "The door is adequate as a precaution, but you could have kept a second key, reasonably, for emergencies. That would have defeated the purpose, and you know it. The purpose is strategically unsound. She smelled like green things and rain and fear. You noticed. I noticed you noticing. We are not going to discuss the part where your heartbeat changed when she looked at you, because I am already deeply embarrassed for both of us." Keon dropped his hands from his face and stared at the ceiling. It was going to be a long night. It was going to be a very long marriage. He went to his study, found a block of wood, picked up a knife, and began to carve. He didn't know what yet. It didn't matter. He needed something for his hands to do that wasn't going back to that door and asking her if she needed anything, if she was cold, if she would like him to set himself on fire to keep her warm. Various increasingly unhinged offerings. She needs us, his wolf said. She needs time. Your time philosophy is inefficient. Also, her wolf. We're having reactions I can't categorize. He carved until dawn, and the wolf finally stopped talking, and he could pretend he wasn't half in love with a woman who'd looked at him like he might hurt her, and was prepared to make strategic calculations about his capacity for cruelty. The days that followed were a study in quiet disorientation. Una woke each morning expecting the trap to spring. It never did. Kian was true to his word. He never approached her chambers without sending a servant first. He never presumed a single intimacy. He also never quite managed to look at her without the expression of a wolf who'd been told he couldn't have something and was processing that as a personal betrayal by the universe. Instead, a strange and relentless campaign of consideration began. On the second morning, she found a cloak draped over a chair by the fire. It was not the heavy, practical fur of the Stonefall wolves. It was made of the softest blue wool she had ever touched, lined with the downy white fur of a mountain hare. The seams were perfect. The weight was ideal. She had shivered in the courtyard upon her arrival. He had noticed. He had sent this across the mountains weeks ago, betting she would be cold. She put it on. It fit perfectly. She buried her face in the collar and inhaled the scent of him, then spent the rest of the morning aggressively reorganizing her chambers to punish herself for caring. Then came the books. A small stack appeared on a table, bound in worn leather. Histories and poetry from the southern kingdoms. Texts her father had always called a frivolous waste of time, because anything that didn't generate coin wasn't worth the clay it was written on. Acquiring them here, in this remote northern fortress, would have required sending a rider south weeks before she'd even arrived. Weeks before their marriage was even finalized. He had planned for her comfort before he knew her. He had guessed at what she might want, and then gone to significant effort to provide it, knowing she might hate him anyway, and that his gesture might be received as condescension or control. It was not. It was worse. It was thoughtfulness. You buried your face in his cloak, her wolf observed. We're not doing denial anymore. We passed denial 3 cloaks ago. This was deeply inconsiderate of him. She had been fully prepared to hate him. He was making it very difficult. On the 5th evening, they took dinner together in a small chamber. 2 chairs, a table, a fire. And a silence so heavy Una considered faking her own death. Kian spoke first. Sorsha tells me the western greenhouse collapsed in the last winter storm. He said it to his plate, not to her. Then he looked up, and his expression was the careful neutral of a man making a conversational offering and absolutely certain it would be rejected with prejudice. We plan to rebuild it. Stronger. The soil in our valley is poor, but in a greenhouse with southern seeds... He trailed off. He was watching her the way she imagined he watched the mountain weather, cautiously, trying to read what was coming. She recognized the fear, that she would laugh or, worse, would recognize this for what it was, a bid for connection, wrapped in the disguise of a technical problem. The oiled skins you use, Una said before she could stop herself, before she could remember that this was a man she barely knew, and that friendliness was a tactic, not a truth. They're heavy. They block too much light and trap moisture in the wrong places. You lose everything to mold. She tensed. It was a criticism of his keep. On her 5th night. It was also the first real thing she'd said to him. But the look that crossed his face was not offense. It was interest, sharp, focused, hungry for the information like a wolf scenting food. Tell me, he said, and it wasn't a request, it was a plea. And so, hesitantly at first, then with increasing confidence as she realized he was actually listening instead of waiting for his turn to speak. She told him. She explained the angled panel system, the ventilation channels, the way her people layered root vegetables beneath taller crops to maximize growing space. She talked about the mathematics of light refraction and soil temperature, and the specific curve of a panel that would catch the winter sun at the latitude of stonefall. He listened with an intensity that was almost unnerving, with the focused attention of a man who understood that she was handing him knowledge that could feed his people. He asked questions, sharp ones, specific ones, questions that revealed he had been thinking about food production in his territory with the grinding, relentless focus of a man who had watched his people go hungry. He was not indulging her. He was consulting her. The angle of the panels, he said, leaning forward. How do you calculate it for this latitude? The ratio changes. I'd need to see the site, the shadows at midwinter. But the principal scales. He looked at her, really looked, as if seeing something unexpected, as if she had handed him something far more valuable than greenhouse advice. Would you be willing to come to the site? Tomorrow? It was the first time anyone in Stonefall had asked her to do something other than exist decoratively. Yes, she said, I would. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, she wasn't sure his face did that, or if it did, that his people had established some kind of regulatory board about it. But the hard lines softened by a fraction. And something inside Una, the part that was already mentally redesigning the greenhouse for northern conditions, the part that had been waiting for permission to matter, purred with a satisfaction she was absolutely not going to examine. Hours, it suggested, regarding the greenhouse and the man sitting across from her, the man who actually cared what she thought. Just the greenhouse. Primarily the greenhouse. Only the greenhouse. She ignored it and continued eating, while her wolf filed everything under permanent acquisition. The next morning, Keon took her to the greenhouse site, or what was left of it. It was a ruin, collapsed wooden framing scattered like broken bones, shattered oiled skins flapping in the wind like the desperation of failed hope, and a sorry patch of frozen dirt where someone had optimistically planted turnips that had not survived the winter. The turnips had given up approximately 2 months ago and had the frozen, sad posture of dreams that knew they weren't going to make it. Una stood in the wreckage and felt the fierce satisfaction of a woman looking at a problem she could solve. The framing is wrong, she said. You've built it flat. North requires steeper pitch, 40 degrees minimum, and the orientation is backwards, east-west for winter sun exposure. Keon stood beside her, arms folded, surveying the wreckage with the expression of a man looking at a problem he'd been losing to for years. His shoulders sagged slightly as she spoke, as though he'd been carrying the weight of this failure and could now set it down. We have a saying in Stonefall, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of something passed down through generations. The mountain gives nothing you have not earned. He looked at the collapsed framing, the dead turnips, the sorry state of all of it. Apparently, that includes vegetables and basic greenhouse architecture. We have been losing rather than earning, it seems. It was the first time she'd heard him be even faintly funny, and it caught her off guard. His tone was so dry, so self-aware about his own failure, that she almost smiled. Almost. She held it back. Sorsha, who had come along with a slate and stylus and the bearing of a woman who had been waiting years for someone to explain why their crops kept dying instead of just dying more quietly, was scratching notes with the grim efficiency of a military commander. She looked at Una with the careful neutrality of someone holding back a very large "I told you so." The turnips? Keon asked, looking at the sad, frozen patch with the tone of someone asking a healer to pronounce on a patient they both knew was dead. Root vegetables need the raised beds on the northern wall, with the glass panels reflecting heat down from the south-facing side. You had them in the coldest spot. Everything dies. We've been losing crops for 3 years, Sorsha said, her voice carefully neutral in the way of someone exercising tremendous restraint. Keon's jaw tightened. I am an alpha, not a farmer. Lucky for you, Una said, crouching to examine the soil. You married one. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. The kind of silence where words hung in the air like they'd been written in fire. She looked up and found both Kian and Sorsha staring at her. Kian's expression was, she couldn't catalog it. Surprise, yes, a kind of shock, but underneath it something warmer and more dangerous. She had said, "You married one," not as a statement of fact, not as a reminder of the political arrangement. Casually, possessively, as if she'd accepted it. She hadn't meant to. The words had slipped out from somewhere underneath her strategies, from the part of her that was already measuring the valley's aspect and calculating panel angles and treating this broken greenhouse as a problem that belonged to her because he belonged to her, though she absolutely was not thinking that. Sorsha broke the moment by thwacking her slate with the stylus, a sound like a gavel coming down. "I'll have the new framing lumber ordered by tomorrow. My queen, if you could draw the specifications." "I'll have them by tonight," Una said, because she had already designed half the greenhouse in her head during dinner the previous evening, and the other half was coming together now, piece by piece, like a puzzle she'd been meant to solve. She spent the day at the site, measuring, sketching, arguing about load-bearing joints. Kian stayed silent, watching. At one point she looked up from a debate about mortise angles and found him leaning against the wall with an expression she could only describe as devastated. The way a man looks when something wanted turns out better than imagined. Something inside her filed that expression under important and returned to calculating panel weight requirements. That evening, alone in his study, Kian sat with a block of wood and a knife and did not carve. He stared at the fire. "You married one," she had said, casually, while crouching in the dirt examining drainage, her hair escaping its braid, her voice sharp with the absolute certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was talking about. She had looked up at him with soil on her hands and annoyance in her eyes, and told him his greenhouse was wrong, and his drainage was catastrophically wrong, and his turnips were in the worst possible location. And he had stood there like a man who'd been hit in the chest with a battering ram and forgotten how to breathe. "See," his wolf said, insufferably smug since the greenhouse. "She is fixing things." She said, "You married one. She is nesting, reorganized your charters." Tell her what, exactly? That her drainage criticism was attractive? That she smells like home, and we are having increasingly irrational thoughts. She organized your entire bureaucratic catastrophe in 3 hours. She moves through your library like she owns it. She's been here 2 weeks. Give her time. You keep saying this, but prepare yourself. She is not leaving, and you need to use words instead of carving wolves. He carved until his hands stopped shaking. It was becoming a habit, the only way he knew how to express things he couldn't say out loud. The only way to get his feelings out of his chest and onto something external before they suffocated him. By the time the sun came up, the block looked exactly like her wolf mid-run. He'd tried not to carve that. He failed. Maeve cornered her that evening, eyes wide with gossip. "He asked me what you like to eat, my lady. The king himself came to me in the kitchens and asked, polite as anything. Said he knew our Viridian palates were different." And the food changed, subtly but unmistakably. Alongside the hearty stews and roasted meats, there were now delicate herb-baked fish, sweet berry tarts, and breads made with finer flour than anything she'd tasted since leaving home. Nothing elaborate, nothing that said, "Look what I can do for you." Just careful attention to the shape of her particular hunger. Maeve also reported the king pacing outside his study, arguing with himself. He said something like, "She's been here 2 weeks, give her time," then paced for an hour. Una filed this under absolutely not thinking about it, and went to bed. Her wolf filed it under obvious and we are pleased. Over the next 3 days, she threw herself into greenhouse designs and found herself reorganizing the keep's library, alphabetizing Kian's trade charters by region and commodity, color-coding his settlement records. Sorsha found her mid-work and froze. "In Stonefall," Sorsha said, voice carefully neutral, "when a she-wolf orders an alpha's den, his records, his rule, it is a declaration of permanent intent. Una stopped. I was just organizing books. You've alphabetized 3 centuries of agreements. The entire keep knows. They're betting on whether the king noticed. Sorsha's eyes gleamed. He did. Hours ago. Went very quiet about it. The moonlight run happened on a night when the walls felt too close, and the strangeness of her new life sat on her chest. She needed to run. The part of her that was all muscle memory ached for ground under her paws, and the freedom of a form that didn't have to think. She slipped out of her rooms and through the small postern gate near the kitchens, barred from the inside with a heavy iron latch, but easy enough to lift from within. The moment she was clear of the walls, she let the shift take her. The change was a familiar agony and release, bones lengthening, senses exploding into a world of scent and sound, and the glorious, uncomplicated now. Her gray wolf shook itself and was immediately present in the world, aware and alive. She flew through the sparse forest, her paws barely touching frozen ground. The joy was a bomb. She ran until her lungs burned and the careful part of her howled with exultation. She was so lost in it that she didn't sense him until he was there. A shadow detached itself from a grove of ancient pines. Massive. A wolf larger than any she had seen, his fur the color of midnight, a living piece of the mountain dark. The Alpha. Kian. He was enormous in this form, too, which she found deeply unfair. She froze, dropping into a crouch, a growl building in her chest. She was fast, but she was half his size. She was also, she had to acknowledge this, her wolf had no choice but to acknowledge it, not actually interested in fighting him. He did not advance. He did not raise his hackles or bare his teeth. He simply stood there, his head lowered slightly, not submission, but respect. A quiet acknowledgement of her right to be here, her right to run, her right to be wild on his territory. An alpha deferring to another wolf's moment. His eyes, even in this form, were that impossible blue. She held his gaze. He was not a threat. He was standing guard. Every predator would recognize his scent and turn away. She flicked her tail and continued running. He paced her at a distance, matching her speed, never closing the gap. When she circled back, he melted into the trees and let her shift in private. She climbed back into her rooms with her heart hammering in her chest, and it was not entirely from the run. He let you lead, the territorial part of her observed, with deep satisfaction. On his own territory, an alpha. He followed your pace instead of setting his own. He did not try to dominate the run. He stayed behind and watched your back, and when you turned for home, he left so you could shift alone, unseen. He treated you like an equal when he could have treated you like prey. A pause, heavy with meaning. This is ours now, all of it. The library, the greenhouse, the mountains, the man. Stop pretending. She pulled the furs over her head and said, out loud, to her empty room. He had followed her. He hadn't meant to, not exactly. He'd been in his study, sleepless as usual, carving a piece of wood that was starting to look very specifically like her. When he'd heard the postern gate. He'd known it was her before his brain had caught up with his senses, the way she moved, light-footed, certain of her exits, already mapped in some deep part of him that tracked her through the keep, the way it tracked weather patterns and supply routes, and the dozen small details of keeping a kingdom alive. He'd shifted and gone after her. Not to stop her. Not to follow in the sense of trailing her like a hunter stalking prey. Just to make sure nothing in his territory touched her while she ran. Just to be present, in case she needed him. Just because the thought of her running alone in the dark, with predators in the mountains, was making his wolf pace in circles. And then she'd run, and the part of him that had been holding itself on a very short leash since the day she stepped out of that carriage, stopped arguing and just watched. She was fast. She was beautiful. She ran like something that had been caged and was remembering what freedom tasted like. And his wolf, his stupid, traitorous, lovesick wolf, had sat in the moonlight and thought, There. That one. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. She had growled at him, and he had not moved, and his wolf had said, with perfect calm, "She is establishing boundaries. This is healthy. Do not ruin it by moving. Stay still. Show her we respect her space." He had not ruined it. He had followed at a distance and guarded her run. And when she turned for home, he had vanished into the pines, because she deserved to come back to herself without an audience. Deserved that privacy. Deserved to shift back into her skin without anyone watching. Back in his study, still smelling of pine and cold air, he picked up the half-finished carving and looked at it properly for the first time. It was her. He had been carving her for a week and pretending he wasn't, lying to himself about the specificity of the proportions, the exact angle of her ears, the particular way she held her head when she was thinking. "You are not subtle," his wolf observed with deep satisfaction. "I am aware. She reorganized your library. She fixed your greenhouse. She ran on your mountain and let you follow. She is not leaving, Kian. You should tell her." "Tell her what?" "That she claimed us the moment she said our drainage was terrible. That she said it with perfect composure, like commenting on the weather, and we lost our minds. That we are absolutely the least subtle man alive when she's in the room. That she's known for weeks and we have no idea what she's going to do about it. I am not telling her any of that." "You should. She alphabetized your trade charters, by region and then by commodity. Your entire bureaucratic system is now logically organized. She has reorganized 3 chambers. She came to the greenhouse site. She is staying. Stop lying to yourself and tell her." He picked up the knife and went back to carving, because the alternative was going to her door and asking her to be his in every way that mattered, and he still had no idea if she actually wanted him or if she was just being professional about the marriage her father had sold her into. Things changed after the run. The silence between them lost its sharp edge and became something else, a companionable quiet, the kind of silence that happens between people who don't need to fill the air to feel the other's presence. A silence that felt like choosing each other over and over in the small moments between words. He started seeking her out for more than greenhouse advice. He would find her in the keep's library, a dusty, neglected room she had claimed as her own, reorganized by subject, and was slowly making habitable, and ask her to look at trade charters from her father. "Your eyes are sharper for the subtleties of Southern language than mine," he said one afternoon, settling into the chair opposite hers as if he'd always sat there. A humble admission from a king, also, she suspected, a transparent excuse to be in the same room as her for an hour. She found she didn't mind the transparence. She didn't call him on it. She was beginning to enjoy the transparence. She was beginning to want more of it. He started walking with her along the battlements in the evenings. The Stonefall wolves grew used to the sight, their enormous alpha and his quiet, green-cloaked queen pacing the walls, heads close together, talking in low voices. They spoke of the pack and its needs, the dwindling grain stores, the sickness that had swept through the lower village, the patrols along the eastern ridge, and whether the increased frequency was necessary or wasteful. He laid his burdens before her without performance, without complaint, the way a man might lay out supplies before a trusted strategist. And in doing so, he showed her the fragile, beating heart of his kingdom. One evening, she said something she hadn't planned. They were discussing the grain shipments from her father, and it came out sideways, the way dark things do. "You know the strangest part? My father calculated the grain-to-bride exchange rate. I know the exact number. 14 wagons, that's what I cost. Barely more than a good harvest." She said it the way she said everything, matter-of-factly, the way you'd report the weather. Kian stopped walking. She didn't. "It's fine," she added over her shoulder. "I've decided to be worth at least 20. He caught up to her in 2 strides. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His jaw was set so tight she could see the muscle jumping, and his eyes had gone that particular shade of furious tender that meant his wolf was very close to the surface. She understood then that he was not angry at her, he was angry for her, at a man who had reduced his own daughter to arithmetic. She changed the subject to patrol rotations, and he let her, because he was learning when to push and when to let her retreat into the practical. One evening on the battlements, the wind picked up sharp and cold, and she shivered. Without breaking stride or looking at her, he unclasped his outer fur and draped it over her shoulders. It weighed approximately as much as a small pony and smelled like him, pine and wood smoke and that underneath scent she still couldn't name, though her wolf had filed it under home. "I have a cloak," she said. "You have a southern cloak. It is inadequate." He said it with the gentle finality of a man who considered the matter closed and was willing to stand in the freezing wind himself if it meant she was warm. She pulled the fur tighter around herself and said nothing, because the truthful response was, "This is the warmest I've been since I got here, and I don't want to give it back. And also, you are an infuriating man who keeps handing me reasons to stay." And the territorial part of her was daring anyone to say it wasn't hers. She found herself caring. She worried when patrols returned late. She felt fierce satisfaction when her grazing rotation saved sheep. The blacksmith's wife brought her pine honey. The tanner's youngest showed her a wolf drawing that looked like a startled cat. When she praised it seriously, Keon made a strange, choked sound and left. He was both laughing and nearly crying that she treated his people like they mattered. Bram, the captain of the guard, stopped her in the courtyard one morning. "You have good teeth, strong jaw. Your pups will be fighters," said with genuine warmth, as if complimenting the bloodline of a brood mare. Una didn't know what to do with the offer of this assessment delivered like a threat. She thanked him. He nodded, satisfied, and walked away as if he'd settled some important matter. Later, she asked Sorcha what on earth that was about. Sorcha only smiled, which was somehow worse. Sorcha started including her in the daily logistics meetings as if she'd always been there, and Una realized with a start that the beta was treating her not as the foreign bride, but as a legitimate authority. Later, Maeve mentioned with barely concealed glee that the wolves were betting on when the king would mark her. Bram had wagered before the first snow. He was looking increasingly smug. Keon had no idea the entire keep was timing his courtship. The least subtle alpha alive. And then the moment happened, the one she couldn't argue away afterward. It was a nothing moment, an ordinary evening. She was in the Great Hall reviewing the week's grain tallies with Sorcha, cross-checking projections, when Keon came in from the cold, snow in his dark hair, his cheeks raw from wind, a torn fur over one arm. He'd been helping repair the outer wall. The Alpha King, hauling stone alongside his own workers, because a section had come loose and weather was going to make it worse. And he didn't ask other people to do things he wouldn't do himself. He stopped to speak to one of the younger wolves, a boy, barely 16, who'd been struggling with his first winter patrol. Una watched him crouch down to the boy's level, which was a feat given his massive size. He said something quiet that made the boy's tense shoulders drop. Encouragement. Not pity, not condescension. Just, "You can do this. I know you can." The boy nodded, straightened, and Keon clapped him on the shoulder. Gentle, careful, the way he was always careful with things smaller than himself, and stood up. He didn't know she was watching. His face was unguarded, tired, worried. The weight of the keep and the winter and the grain stores and the wall and the boy and all of it, visible for just a second before he reassembled himself, put the mask of the king back on, became the alpha again. And Una thought, with the sudden, terrible clarity of a woman stepping off a cliff, oh no. It wasn't the gifts. It wasn't the key or the cloak or the books or the moonlight run. It was this. Him. The man who hauled stone and crouched down to talk to frightened boys and carried an entire kingdom on his back and didn't know how to ask for help. The man who carved her wolf in secret because his hands needed something to do that wasn't reaching for her. The man who looked at her like she was the thing keeping him alive. She was in love with him. She was catastrophically, irrevocably, inconveniently in love with him. And it had probably been true for weeks. And the only person who hadn't known was her. Finally, her wolf said, with the bone-deep satisfaction of someone who had been right about the real estate from day one, who had known from the moment she smelled him that he was hers. I have been waiting. You are very slow. Glacially slow. He smells like home, and you have known this since the cloak, since before the cloak, since the courtyard. Stop pretending. Shut up, Una whispered, but there was no heat in it, because her wolf was right, and her hands were shaking, and across the hall Keon looked up and met her eyes and smiled. Just a small one, just for her, a smile that made his entire face rearrange itself into something almost unbearably beautiful. And her heart did something so structurally unsound that she was amazed it didn't collapse entirely. She looked back down at the grain tallies and did not see a single number for the rest of the evening. The figures blurred, the calculations became meaningless. All she could think about was that smile, that careful attention, that man who gave her keys and carved her into wood and asked her opinion on matters of state. Stonefall was no longer a posting. It was no longer a cage. It was hers. This library, this fire, this infuriating greenhouse, this impossible, gentle, dangerous man. You have no reasons to keep him at arm's length, the territorial part of her pointed out, with the force of a battering ram. You have strategies. Strategies are not reasons. You are hiding behind a list you made in a carriage when you were afraid, and you are no longer afraid. You are angry that you are not afraid. You are furious that this worked. Stop it. She told it to be quiet. It was getting harder to win those arguments. It was also becoming more difficult to care about winning them. Then she found the wolf. She found his study empty, a fire dying in the grate. On the work table sat a block of pale wood and a knife, and next to it, half finished, a wolf. Gray, small, caught mid-run. Even incomplete, the craftsmanship was extraordinary. It was her wolf. She recognized the proportions, the ears, the angle of her spine when she thought. He had carved her from memory. From the moonlight run, from the greenhouse site, from watching her move through his keep like she owned it. Something inside her cracked. The stone fortress of strategy and distance breaking open. He hadn't meant for her to see this. It was a man's heart carved into wood because he couldn't say it. She put it back and left, feeling like she'd swallowed a lit coal. Tell him, the part of her that had already claimed the library and the greenhouse and the battlements and, quietly, stubbornly, without permission, the man who walked them with her insisted. Tell him you saw it. Tell him you're staying. Tell him. She didn't. Not yet. Not until she could figure out how to say it without lying. That evening at dinner, she sat across from him and felt the unfinished wolf between them like a third presence, a ghost of everything he wanted and everything she was terrified to want. The silence was different tonight, charged, full of things neither of them had said. She could feel him watching her when she looked down, could feel the careful way he chose each word as if measuring its weight, as if afraid of breaking something. The greenhouse frame is coming along, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Your panel calculations were right. The light falls exactly where you said it would. Of course they were right, she said, and something in his expression shifted. His head came up. He'd been studying his plate. Now he was studying her. I know how to calculate panel angles, Keon. I'm good at this. I know, he said quietly. That's why I asked. It was such a simple thing, an acknowledgement that she had skills, that she had value, that she was worth asking. But it landed like a weight. She had been trained her entire life by a man who measured her value in political utility. Here was a man who measured her value in what she could do, what she knew, who she was. You don't lack for confidence, he said, attempting to lighten the moment. You married a Viridian princess for grain and got structural engineering. I'd call that lucky. His face cracked into a smile. She looked away, flustered. He reached across the table. His fingers hesitated in the air for a long moment. She could see the internal argument happening behind his eyes, the man holding something back, overriding an instinct that wanted to move faster. She had seen that hesitation before. In the quarters, when he almost matched his stride to hers and then deliberately slowed. On the battlements, when his hand would drift toward the small of her back and then redirect to the wall, as if he couldn't trust his own size not to be intrusive. He was a man on a leash, and the leash was his own conscience. I found the carving, she said. The wolf, in your study, 4 days ago. His hand froze. Something moved across his face. Shock, then a flush of color that climbed his neck, then an expression she could only describe as cornered. His large, capable hands went very still on the table. It wasn't finished, he said, voice rough. He sounded like he'd swallowed gravel. I know. The silence stretched like taffy. His jaw worked. She could see the effort it cost him not to retreat behind the kingly mask, not to become distant and formal and safe. Then, very quietly, in a voice she had never heard from him before, stripped, without armor, a man putting his entire self on the table. I should not have. It was not my place to. He stopped. Tried again. You are not obligated to. Kian, she cut him off. She reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers twitched under hers, but he didn't pull away. She held on because she was tired of strategies, and she was tired of waiting, and she was tired of being a stone. I pulled away because I was afraid, not of you, of wanting to stay. His breath caught, a small sound from a very large man. I have been a stone for a very long time, she said. It is the only thing my father ever taught me that was useful. Be hard. Don't break. Don't want things you can't have. But Her throat closed. She pushed through it because this mattered. I think I've been a stone at you, and you didn't deserve it. His hand turned under hers, his fingers threading through hers with the gentleness of someone handling something impossibly precious. He looked down at their joined hands with an expression of bewildered wonder, as if she had handed him something fragile and was terrified of breaking it. When he looked up, the mask was gone. Just the man, tired, hopeful, and so transparent it hurt to look at. You are the most infuriating woman I have ever met, he said, and his voice cracked on it. You redesign my greenhouse and correct my trade agreements and argue with my beta about sheep logistics, and I cannot think about anything else. He stopped, visibly wrestling with himself, his jaw clenching. His ears went red. I had to start carving things to keep my hands busy, he finished, with the tone of a man confessing to a crime. Una laughed. It burst out of her, a real, startled laugh she couldn't control, the first one in months, the kind that came from the belly and made her shake. The sound of it seemed to stun him. Then something in his face broke open, and he was smiling, a full, real, devastating smile that transformed his entire face from stone to something alive and open and entirely devoted to her. You're laughing at me, he said, and there was a hint of a smile in his voice. You just told me you took up woodworking because you have a crush. Yes, I am absolutely laughing at you. It is a highly practical skill. You carved my wolf from memory. You can't possibly sell this as practical. The flush was now roughly the color of sunset. He looked down at their joined hands and said nothing, but the smile stayed, and his thumb moved slowly across her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her chest ache, and neither of them let go. It would be another hour before anyone noticed they were still sitting there. It would be 3 hours before they moved. The next morning, a finished carving appeared on her mantelpiece. The gray wolf, mid-run, head thrown back in a silent howl. Complete. Every detail perfect. Still no note. She put it next to the iron key, which she had placed there on her first night, and looked at the two objects side by side. A key and a wolf. A man who locked himself out and then stayed up nights carving her in wood because he couldn't tell her with words. A man who understood the power of giving her choices and then respecting them. She was, she realized, in very serious trouble. Finally, her instinct said, with deep satisfaction, "The man is ours. The territory is ours. Everything is ours now." The warm thing growing between them had exactly 2 days of peace before Kaelin's letter arrived. Bram appeared in the doorway of the small dining chamber, his face grim, his hand on his sword. "My king, a rider from Viridia. He carries a message for the queen. From Lord Kaelin." Kian's hand, which had been resting near hers on the table, not quite touching because the man apparently needed another week to work up to sustained hand-holding without stammering, withdrew. His face shuddered. She could see the walls go up, the king reasserting himself over the man. The letter was fine Viridian parchment, scented with Kaelin's signature cedarwood. Of course it was scented. She read it with Kian standing by the hearth, his back to her, every line of his body rigid with the kind of tension that came from holding in a growl. "My dearest Una," it began, and she almost laughed at the absurdity. "Every day you spend in that cold, gray prison is an agony to me. The Stonefall Savage will not keep you. I am coming. We will strike at the next new moon. A small party will create a diversion at the eastern gate. I will come for you at the old postern by the kitchens. Be ready to fly. Yours always, Kaelin." She read it twice, the second time with strategic clarity. Kaelin's postern would lead straight into Bram's night watch. He didn't know the keep. Men would die for a rescue she didn't need. "His tactical planning is impressive," she said quietly. "My father always said Kaelin's greatest talent was his hair." Kian, rigid by the hearth, made a sound that might have been a cough but was definitely not a cough. She understood what he was doing, waiting to find out if his world was ending. "Kian?" He turned slowly. His face was controlled. His eyes were not. She crossed the room and held out the letter. "Read this." He took it. She watched his expression shift from tension to disbelief, to a cold, focused fury that was almost beautiful in its precision. His wolf was close. She could feel the change in the air around him, the low vibration of a growl he was holding in his chest with visible effort. "He will lead them into a slaughter," Kian said quietly, his voice steady. "The postern gate. He'd walk right into Bram's night watch. He'd walk into my people who have been training for exactly this. He'd walk in thinking it was a bedroom and find soldiers. He doesn't know the keep. He assumes it's as poorly laid out as my father's. He hasn't bothered to actually scout it." Kian looked at her. The fury in his eyes warred with something fragile and desperate. "He speaks of you as a prisoner. He believes you are waiting for him." She held his gaze. "He believes what he wants to believe. He is in love with an idea of me, a helpless, decorative thing that belongs to him, a girl in a tower who needs rescuing. He never once bothered to see who I actually am." She took a breath. "This is my home now. These are my people. And you are my alpha." She had said those words before, at the ceremony. This time they weren't a formality. They were a vow. The control in his face crumbled. Not the king, not the alpha, just the man, raw and open and so full of terrified hope that she almost couldn't bear to look at him. "I was afraid," he said, barely a whisper, "that it was all just decorations on a cage, that your heart was still in Viridia." "My heart is right here," she said, and took his hand, and this time she held on with the kind of grip that said, "I'm not letting go." "It has been for a while. I was just too much of a stone to say it." His hand tightened on hers. He looked at her as though she had handed him the sun, the moon, the entire kingdom wrapped in silk. Then his jaw set, and the king was back. The new moon is in 3 days. We must prepare. What will you do? Kill them? I won't start a war with Viridia if it can be avoided. He looked at her. Kaelin is coming for you. It is your right to decide how we meet him. He was giving her the power, making her a true partner. The trust in that was absolute. An idea formed. He wants to see a prisoner. He expects beaten and broken. He wants to be a hero. A spark of something fierce and darkly amused lit in her chest. Let's give him a hero's welcome, just not the one he's expecting. On the night of the new moon, Una stood in her chambers, dressed in dark leathers, a leaf-bladed spear in her hand. It was the one weapon she'd trained with seriously, not as a girl playing at self-defense, but as a Viridian noblewoman who'd spent 6 years drilling with the palace guard captain because her father believed a princess who couldn't protect herself was a liability to be managed. She'd hated those lessons with every fiber of her being. She'd never been more grateful for them. Maeve watched her with a face the color of curdled milk, caught between horror and pride. My lady, you cannot. The most dangerous thing I can do right now, Maeve, is nothing. She tested the spear's balance, the old muscle memory settling into her hands like a homecoming. I was sold by my father, shipped across a mountain range, married to a stranger, and I reorganized his library within a week. If Kaelin thinks I need rescuing, he has fundamentally misunderstood which of us is dangerous. Hers. The word settled in her chest like a stone finding its true resting place, the stone that kept her grounded, the stone that was no longer a cage. A knock at the door. Keon, dressed for a fight, his eyes only for her. He looked at the spear, and his expression was not disapproval, but fierce, undeniable pride. He looked at her like she had just handed him a gift more precious than gold. Ready? Yes. They descended together into the courtyard. The fog was thick, the kind that muffled sound, that made shadows of everything. Keon's best warriors were invisible in the darkness on the rooftops. The diversion howls had begun at the eastern gate, wolves running, appearing to attack, creating chaos that had nothing to do with them. The postern gate scraped. The iron bar had been left unlatched from within on Keon's orders, because the trap required bait. Kaelin slipped in with 2 men, sword drawn, dressed in dramatic dark finery, because of course he was, because he was still thinking of this as a story where he was the hero. He scanned the empty courtyard with a smug smile that made Una's skin crawl. Easier than I thought. The northern savages are lazy. Where is she? Keon stepped from the shadows on one side. Una stepped into the torchlight on the other. Kaelin's head whipped toward her. Triumph flooded his face. Then confusion. She was not in a tower. She was not chained. She was standing in the courtyard, armed, armored in dark leather, looking at him the way one might look at a stain on the floor, something unpleasant that needed cleaning. Una! He strode toward her, his sword lowering slightly. I am here. You are safe. Your betrothed is in Viridia, Kaelin. Her voice carried through the fog like a blade. Dead and buried with a promise you failed to honor. I am the Queen of Stonefall. His handsome face twisted. He's turned you into his soldier, the monster. You see a monster, Una said, stepping forward, placing herself in front of Keon. Because that is all you know how to look for. You look at me and see a possession that was taken from you. He looks at me and sees a partner, a queen. Someone worth asking, not just taking. Another step. You offered me pretty words and a gilded cage. He offered me a key and a kingdom to help him rule. I am not your damsel. This is my home, and I will not let you burn it. From the rooftop, one of Keon's warriors raised an eyebrow at the "Northern savages are lazy" comment. Bram, in the shadow of the courtyard arcade, made a sound that might have been a laugh. Short, sharp. The sound of a man watching his investment in this woman's competence pay off. Kalen lunged. Not at Kian, at her. He meant to grab her, to drag her back into the story he'd written in his head, where she was grateful and broken and his. He never reached her. Kian moved, no blade, just his body, catching Kalen's sword arm and twisting, with the precise application of force that separated the soldier from the brute. The crack of bone was sharp in the fog. Kalen screamed. His sword rang off the stone. His two men charged. Una spun. The spear was an old friend in her hands. She swept the first man's legs and brought the butt up hard under the second man's chin. Both down. 3 seconds. Barely breathing hard. Silence. Kalen was on his knees, clutching his arm. Kian's wolves materialized from everywhere. Rooftops, shadows, the darkness itself. Kian stood over the kneeling lord, enormous and quiet, and absolutely still. He looked at Una. A quick glance. Your call. She shook her head, slightly. Death makes martyrs. Disgrace is worse. He understood. He crouched in front of Kalen with the ease of a man comfortable with his own power. You came to be a hero, but you have no honor. You threatened a queen in her own home. He gestured to Bram. Take his sword, and his boots. Let him walk. He stood and turned his back on Kalen as if the man had ceased to exist. He walked to Una, his eyes scanning her for injury. Finding none, he took the spear gently from her hands and set it aside. You were magnificent, he breathed. I know, she said, because she was done being modest, done being careful, done being anything other than what she was. His startled laugh echoed off the stone walls. A real laugh, full and unguarded. The first one she'd heard from him. Pure delight. Several of his warriors on the rooftops exchanged glances. One of them, the young wolf with the jug-handle ears who'd given Maeve his cloak on the journey north, grinned openly. Bram supervised the removal of Kalen and his men with the efficient disgust of a man cleaning something unpleasant off his boot. As they marched the barefoot, one-armed lord toward the gate, Una called out, Kalen! He turned, his face a mask of pain and humiliation. When you get home, she said, tell my father the alliance holds. Tell him I said that the Lady of Stonefall sends her regards. And tell him... She paused, considering. Tell him the greenhouse is coming along beautifully. Kalen stared at her as though she had spoken a foreign language. Behind her, she heard Kian make that strange, choked sound again, the one he made when something delighted him and he didn't know where to put it. She suspected that this time he was absolutely laughing, with pride and joy and the kind of love that has nowhere to hide. They walked back through the quiet corridors, the adrenaline fading into bone-deep exhaustion. When they reached her door, the same lock, the same key, he stopped. He looked down at her. All the kingly authority was gone, just the man. Una, he said, and couldn't seem to find what came next. She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft, firm, a promise, not a question. He made a sound against her mouth, quiet, involuntary, like something inside him had finally unclenched. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his breath unsteady, holding her as carefully as he held everything, as carefully as he held his kingdom, as carefully as he held hope. And something shifted, not in the corridor, not in the keep, in the space between them. A warmth that had nothing to do with the torchlight, spreading from where her lips had touched his, settling into her chest like a second heartbeat. The animal part of her, the part that had been claiming things all along, the library and the greenhouse and the fur and the man, went very still and very certain. Not a verdict, a recognition. Something clicking into place that had been waiting a long time for both of them to catch up. She felt it. She knew he felt it too, because his breath stopped for a moment and his hand tightened on hers. And when he opened his eyes, they were raw with something that went deeper than want. This was the bond. Not completed, not yet, but forming, pulling. A thread between them that would need a marking to seal. And that was for later, when the night wasn't full of fog and adrenaline and the sound of Kaylin's humiliation still echoing off the walls. Later. They had time. They would have time. She stepped back, pushed open the door. The fire was burning inside, bright and warm. She held out her hand. Stay. He looked at her hand, looked at her face, and smiled, slow, wondering, like a man watching the sun come up over his own mountains for the first time. Like a man who'd been living in darkness and had just remembered what light was. He didn't need a key. He took her hand and followed her in, and the door closed on the cold stone hallway and the last of their separate pasts, and neither of them looked back. They were home, both of them, together. The mountain gives nothing you have not earned. They had earned this.